So I wanted to welcome everybody to our presentation today. I also wanted to welcome our presenter. We have Marty here with us.
Great, thank you. And welcome everyone. Hopefully everyone has, excited to hear some information about informational interviewing, mastering the art of informational interviewing. My name is Marty Gahbauer. I'm the Executive Director for the Weekend Center for Professional Excellence, which is the Career Center at Elmhurst University. I am also a presenter and workshop presenter at the Career Transition Center, which is located downtown. And together with my colleagues here, we've been putting on programs at the Skokie Library, the Niles Library, and various libraries throughout the North Shore, giving career advice. Today, as I mentioned, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about informational interviewing. And just really quickly, how I come to talk to you about informational interviewing. So I transitioned into my current career, which is in higher ed, from a different career. I was in advertising for, gosh, almost 25 years. And when I decided to make my transition out of that into a new field, whatever it might be, that's when I utilized informational interviewing. So over the course of 14 months, which matched up almost exactly with the Great Recession, the official dates of the Great Recession, I did 125 informational interviews. And at the time, I was also a client at the Career Transition Center. And somebody from a accountability group that I belonged to there had mentioned, had asked me if I could put together a presentation on informational interviewing because it seemed to have been helpful to me in my search. And, that was in 2009. And since that time, I've gone back to the Career Transition Center and various other places and given the presentation that grew out of that. And this is directly related to the experience that I was able to gain while doing those informational interviews. And again, it's something that worked for me. There's a number of experienced professionals who are on the call today who will also be able to bring something to their form of informational interviewing. So, which is why I've titled it Mastering the Art of Informational Interviewing. So with that, let's jump right into it. And typically when I do this in front of people live, I try and get a gauge from the room in terms of what their knowledge base is in regarding informational interviewing. Since we're doing this virtually, I've created a quick poll that folks can hopefully do. And as you can see up on the screen, the URL should be there and should also be in the either the chat box function or the question answer function here in the Zoom platform. So if you could just take a quick moment to participate in this poll, that would be wonderful. And I'm going to switch over to the portion of the different website where this is located. And let me close out of this. Thank you. It looks like folks are already taking the poll. Yeah, so it looks like we've got quite a few folks, the goodly majority actually of people who might be a bit familiar with it or not familiar with it. There's a few that maybe have done them in before and just have some questions about processes. That's great. I'll be able to answer all those questions. And in terms of, and even for those who consider themselves a pro, I think I've got some information in there that might be really helpful to individuals. So with that, we can move right into sort of the meat of the presentation, if you will. And I'm going to assume a couple of things here. I'm assuming for the folks that have been a part of these series that we've done, that everybody sort of has done their 101 when it comes to job search, right? You understand sort of your brand, who you are, what your strengths and abilities are. You know how to effectively communicate it through an elevator pitch, through a resume and a cover letter. And I'm assuming that you have gone out and started to do some networking, right? And you have a target list pulled together, potentially of either which industry that you might be interested in working in, or which company that you might be interested in working for, etc. Those are the assumptions that I'm making going into this. So let's assume you've gotten a contact name via networking at a target company or industry that you're interested in. Now what? That's where informational interviewing can come into play. So I'm going to start, interestingly, about what informational interviewing is not. And what it is not is a job interview. So often people will confuse the two, informational interviewing and a job interview, as being the same. And really, there's no quicker way to end an informational interview than by treating it as if it were a job interview. And so a recommendation that I have is to leave your resume either at home or in your briefcase when you go to do your informational interview. Why do I say that? Well, when you put your resume out in front of somebody, what are you saying to that individual after you've asked them for an informational interview? Really what you're saying is, I'm looking for a job, right? So you've sort of done a bait and switch. You've said, I'd like to have an informational interview with you, gain more information about an industry, a company, maybe a position, etc. But when you put that resume out in front of an individual right away, in essence, what you're saying is, I'm hoping you can give me a job. And that puts that person sort of on the spot and puts them in an untenable position, because most often there's not a position that's available at the time, or they may not even be a hiring manager. So again, it's okay if they ask you for a resume and you have it in your briefcase and you pull it out. It's okay to follow up with it at a later point in your thank you note, for instance. But again, when they ask for it or when you do your follow-up. So if that's what informational interviewing is not, what is informational interviewing? Sort of right in the title, right? An informal yet highly focused discussion with a networking contact for the sole purpose of gaining information or knowledge, right? It's right there, sort of in the headline, informational interviewing. Again, it's about gaining information about company, a job, etc. That's what it is. And having gone through this myself and having spoken to many, many job seekers, you know, they'll say to me, well, you know, if it's not about a job, then why should I be spending my time doing this, right? I need a job. I get that. I get that. But there's a lot of reasons, a lot of benefits of doing informational interviews. And I'm just going to go through some of them right now. Number one, you can learn about skills and abilities needed to succeed in a position or company, right? A lot of times you may be thinking, this is what I need to be successful, either in that industry, new industry that I'm looking at, or that new company that I'm looking at. It's got a similar sort of job. But you don't really know until you talk with somebody who's in that industry or doing that job that you think you'd like to do, where you can actually learn what skills or abilities are truly needed to be successful. So that's a benefit that it'll provide you. The other thing it provides, and I think this is probably one of the most important things it does, is identifying culture and fit potential. I am a huge believer in cultural fit and it's determinant on your success, wherever it may be that you land. And I think the logic is pretty straightforward and simple, right? If you are in a company or an organization where the culture suits you, where you feel like comfortable, this is where I belong, the likelihood that you're going to be doing a good job is pretty high. The more you're doing a good job, the chance for your success is also higher. The challenge, though, however, in a traditional job interview is it's really difficult to get at culture and to get at that fit potential, because the kind of questions that you have to ask, you can't really ask in a traditional job interview, right? You can't ask like, so what are the hours here? Or how much vacation time am I going to get? And, do people really like to hang out with each other here? Those are the kind of questions that you can ask, however, at an informational interview, and they give you really, really good clues about what that organization is to work for. And again, if you've done your homework, like I mentioned up front, if you understand your own strengths, skills, and abilities, and importantly, your values, you can see how do those two things mesh. And if they mesh pretty well, your chance, again, for succeeding at that company or organization are going to be pretty good. The other thing that informational interviewing will be able to provide is, this one's probably pretty self-evident, but brushing up on interviewing skills, right? Because in an informational interview, you're asking questions, they're asking questions back of you as well. So it's the kind of skill set that you're going to need when you go out and do a traditional job interview. The other thing that if you do this right, and I'll get into this a little bit when we talk about the process, is you will be generating additional networking contacts, which is something that's critically important in effective job search. You will also increase your visibility. What do I mean by that? Probably the best way to describe this is, right, we live in Chicagoland, right? And one of the famous sayings is in Chicago is, don't send me nobody knows, right? What is that statement actually saying? It's saying you need to be somebody who's a known quantity. Now, how do you get to do that if you're like looking at an industry maybe that you're not that familiar with or you're new to? You can do that by doing informational interviews. When I decided to make my switch from advertising into higher ed, I talked to, I don't want to say every higher ed institution, but quite a few of them in the Chicagoland area, specifically within the area of career services. And those hiring managers, those directors of those offices started to know who I was. They started to ask me to help out with them, volunteer my time on certain things. That increased my visibility. So when a position did open up, I started to become that known quantity, right? I became that somebody knew, which is really, really important when it comes to effective job searches. You can discover an area or a field you never knew about. That's certainly true in my case. When I did my job search, I effectively went down 3 areas at the same time, I learned that from a gentleman by the name of Orville Pearson. He's a former senior vice president of Lee Hecht Harrison, which is one of the largest outplacement firms in the country. Through their database, they found that individuals that go down 3 paths at the same time concurrently, their time in transition is shorter. For me, that was either doing brand management, so doing the same thing I did on the advertising agency side, but do it at the client. Perhaps do something with my knowledge of German language and business culture. I had the good fortune of working overseas in Germany for 2 years and thought, well, maybe I could do something with that here in Chicago. The third area was higher ed. Always been interested in education, didn't know where a person like me with my background, where I could fit. That's when, after talking with individuals within higher ed, I discovered career centers. When I was in college, they didn't really have career centers. They had something called placement centers, and I maybe went in mine once. So I wasn't really knowledgeable at all about this field. So again, great way to explore and discover things you never knew about. And the other thing is, and this may sound like I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth, but you could stumble across a hidden job market, right? I think it was in Mike's presentation and follow-up presentations that were done by Jerry and Joan as well, the number of positions that are open that actually get posted are something like in the 50 to 60% range, maybe even, maybe it goes as high as 70%, right? That means a goodly number of those positions aren't even posted. So how do those positions get filled? They get filled through networking. They get filled through individuals who have heard about it from somebody who works at that company. And when I was doing my informational interviewing, something like this happened to me as well. Somebody that I had done an informational interview with had reached out to me a couple of months later and said, "Marty, are you still in the market?" I said, "I am." He said, "Well, our former president has now gone to a new institution and they're looking to hire somebody in the area of marketing. Would you be interested?" "Of course, please send along my resume," which he did. And I was able to get myself a interview with that president before the position was even posted. Now, I didn't get that job, but nonetheless, I did get a chance at it before it was posted. So again, you never know what you might learn when you do an informational interview. And I think this is probably another important distinction to point out about informational interviews. Unlike a job interview, the locus of power is different, right? In a traditional job interview, where does the power sit? That sits across the table, right, from the person that's hiring for that particular job, not with you. In an informational interview, really it's almost flipped. You are the person who's in control. You're the person who's reaching out to those individuals. You're asking them for an informational interview. If they agree, you're setting it up, and then you're going to run it when it happens. So you are the person in charge. And that, I think, is really, really important for those of you who might be on the call who tend to be introverts to realize. The person who initially asked me to pull this presentation together was an introvert. And when I touched on this topic for her, it made her feel far more comfortable about reaching out to individuals to set up informational interviews, because she realized that she was the one who was going to be taking charge of this. So again, a critical difference between the two. And I mentioned as we were going through this, you know, there's a number of individuals who maybe haven't done this or done much of this at all, and you have some individuals that who thought they were pretty well along with informational interviewing. The great thing about informational interviewing is it's a flexible tool that can be used really at any point in time during your job search. And I'll talk through it really quickly here. So in phase one, let's say you are exploring opportunities, right? You could be like me, where you were taking a look at a new industry that you didn't know about. Or it could be somebody that maybe is in a field, is interested in this company and just wants to learn more about the company. In that phase, the person that you want to reach out to for an informational interview really is anybody who either works at that company or organization or within that industry, right? You're basically just trying to learn as much as you can about that industry, just to get a gauge, is this thing right for me or not? Is this company right for me or not, right? So that's sort of the phase one, the exploring opportunities phase that I like to call it. The next one is sort of phase two, right? You've talked to somebody within the industry, you're starting to say, okay, I think this could be right for me. or this company, right? I think this position within that company could be right for me. Who you want to talk to in that phase are really people doing that job that you think it is you want to do, right? At that same position level that you're interested, that you want to move forward with. I call that clarification and validation, right? What you're basically trying to ascertain is, does my skills, strengths, and abilities match up well with what it takes to be successful in that job? And if there's a good mesh, right, great, that's good. You've discovered that's the right industry, the right job for me. The next phase is what I call strategic prospecting. This phase and the way you treat an informational interview here is a little bit different. What you're trying to do here is get to those hiring managers, right? You've identified that job, that position that you really want. Now what you want to do is start talking to those individuals that actually do the hiring for those positions. And how you talk to them and set it up is a little bit different. I'll get into that process. But again, you can see how this tool is very flexible no matter where you might be in that spectrum of job search. So this comes to the next poll question that I have. So if you can go back to that same area, and I'll forward along to the next question. Sorry, there you go. So the next question here is, what part of the process do you want to learn more about? And the specific areas is how to reach out for an informational interview, how to conduct the informational interview, what types of questions to ask, how to use informational interviews during those phases of the job search, the follow-up process, etc. So I'll just wait a little bit for folks to navigate to that page and just answer the questions in terms of what areas that they want me to expound on a little bit more. I'll cover all these areas, but I can expound on a little bit more depending on where folks are at. And one thing I do want to mention as well, there is a follow-up handout that we will distribute that will include a lot of this information. And the other thing is the presentation that I'm going through right now is also available 24/7 on Prezi.com. So really, if you just sort of Google my name and informational interviewing, it should be one of the first things that pops up, and you can always refer back to it. So it looks like folks want to know how to reach out, again, how you can use informational interviews, and I'll touch on that. What types of questions? That's the types of questions. I have some starter questions in the handout. And then again, the great thing about nowadays is you can just hop on Google, Google informational interviewing questions, and you'll get a plethora of them. So let me jump back into the presentation. Thank you for taking the polls. Appreciate it. So how do you get an informational interview? And again, what I'm going to talk to is a process that worked for me. It was effective, and as you do more of these, you'll find what works really well for you. The process that worked for me was I would send a request via either email or LinkedIn to a networking contact. I would follow up with a phone call, set up a time with them, hold the interview. Once we're back to normal life, you'll be able to do this in person. But the great thing is now you can do so much of these things virtually. And then, of course, send up a follow-up thank you note when you're done with it. And then, ask if it's okay if you update the individuals on your progress of your search. So the request for an informational interview, I sort of set up this way. And how you do it on LinkedIn is going to be a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if you're sending it out via email, the paragraph really is mention how you got their name, right? Again, you would have gotten a networking contact name from an individual during your networking sessions, or perhaps from an informational interview, and that's how you're reaching out to them. And then the second paragraph, you give them a bit of a background about yourself, right? That's important because it establishes your credibility. Individuals are very time pressed nowadays. You're asking them to donate some of their time to you to do an informational interview. They're not just going to do that for anybody. That second paragraph is all about why they should donate their time and wisdom to you. The third paragraph is asking time for a brief informational interview and then thanking them in advance for considering. A tip I learned along the way is ask for 20 minutes, because nobody schedules their calendars in 20-minute increments. They schedule them at least in half-hour increments. So by asking for 20 minutes, you're actually going to get 30. You got to be cognizant of the time as you come up against that 20-minute mark, but nonetheless, invariably, you will get at least a half an hour, probably more. So the example I have for that is, and again, I'm a bit old school, and this is going back to when I was managing my transition. I would not send out an ask in this form anymore. This second paragraph here is way too long. But again, it serves the purpose of exemplifying what I'm trying to say, right? And you see here, what I was doing was I was reaching out to the director of the Career Center at my alma mater at University of Illinois, basically asking for an informational interview. How I gotten her name was through a gentleman who I'd done a phone informational interview with, who was at the University of Texas at Austin. So you see, as you do this thing, you start to get some breath behind it, right? I mean, you really start to talk to a number of individuals. In any case, this ask went with, Dear X, as director of the Career Center, your time is extremely valuable. I'll keep this brief. The director of placement at University of Texas passed along your name as a helpful contact as I manage my career transition. To provide a brief overview, then I go into a bit of my background again. I would never make this long anymore. What I would recommend is doing it, this paragraph being 3 sentences max. Try and keep it brief. Again, the most critical thing though is that it has to achieve the objective. The objective of that paragraph is to establish your credibility. Why should they say yes to you for an informational interview? So keep that in mind. And then the third paragraph is the ask, right? As a next step in my career, I'm passionately interested in applying my talents in the higher education arena, specifically in career services. In pursuit of that goal, I'd like to ask for 20 minutes of your time to gain your perspective. I will call your office next week to arrange for a time for a brief informational interview. Thank you in advance for your time and consideration. Again, that point of you are the one who's driving this. You are in charge. Be proactive as you go through this process. And again, if there's questions that come up, please put them in the chat, and then Mike will translate them for me or talk me through them.
Yeah, Marty, this is Mike. Just an update. It's 3:30, just so you know.
Thank you. Yes, and typically what I like to do here is take a brief moment to write up a draft informational interview request. In the interest of time, we've got about a half an hour. Actually, why don't we take a quick 5 minutes to have folks take a stab at doing it. I'll pull this back up so you've got an example. And then again, maybe we'll take maybe just a little bit less than 5 minutes for folks to take a shot at it. So, and let's just say in about 3 more minutes, I'll come back and ask folks how that felt for them. Hopefully everyone can see the example that I've pulled up on screen. Do I have an individual who might want to read out loud what they were able to accomplish in the past 4 or 5 minutes? A brave soul?
Hey, Marty, there's a question maybe in the
Sure.
meantime. Person Susie asked, is it okay to say I will call to arrange a time? Is that presumptuous, or is it too soft to say to try arrange a time that works with your schedule?
No, I think that would work really effectively, again, because you know, you're showing that you're being proactive. I will call your office to see if we can arrange a time. I think that's fine language to utilize. That's okay. We can also move on. I just had thought if there was somebody who wanted to read out loud what they've been able to write up, would be a nice opportunity to share with the individuals on the call. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and move on. And again, this example will be in the packet that you receive. So at least it gives you something to work off of. So, all right, how do you conduct an informational interview? Let's say you sent the request off and they've said yes. You know, be prepared. Number one, that's important, right? You are in charge of this thing. That means you have to be prepared for it. Have your questions scripted, at least initially as you start doing your informational interviews, because you've got 20 minutes of an individual's time, perhaps more, perhaps 30 or 60, regardless. You want to be able to use that time effectively and make sure that you get your questions asked. So script them out in advance. Be professional, you know, dress appropriately and be on time. Again, time is critically important here. People are very busy, so be on time. And if you can't, make sure that you've got your phone with you just to let folks know, I'm sorry, I've run into some traffic. I won't be able to make it. Hopefully we can reschedule for a later date or time. Be a good listener, right? That's why you're there. You're there to get information. So just make sure that you're listening and learning as much as you possibly can. And then be a harvester. And what I mean by that is, you know, get as many contact names as you can when you go through the process of the informational interview. And I'll talk a little bit about like when to ask for that if it hasn't come up. So the next thing is, you know, again, be courteous, thank them for taking time out of their day. And this next point I think is critically important, because sometimes when you go through a job search, you know, it's definitely a roller coaster that you go through, and you can feel like perhaps, you know, well, I'm not working right now. You can feel a little bit downtrodden. But what's really, really important to know and keep in mind is just the knowledge and the wisdom and the experience that you have. And you bring a lot to the table. So by asking that individual at the end, thank you so much for the information that you've been able to provide me. If I can help you in any way in the future, please let me know, right? That does a couple of really important things. It offers up a way for you to say thank you for the time that you've and the wisdom that you've provided me. And secondly, it underscores your own self-efficacy, right? Your own sense of experience that you bring to the table. And you never know how you can help an individual out. A great example I have of that is I was speaking to a director at UIC, somebody who headed up their foundation development area. Finished off, had a very nice informational interview. I said, you know, if I can help you in any way in the future, please let me know. He said, Marty, you used to be in advertising. Yes, that's correct. My daughter is graduating in advertising. Would you happen to have some contact names that she might be able to reach out to? I said, of course. In my follow-up thank you note, I provided 3 contact names for his daughter to follow up with. She followed up with them and actually got a job with one of them. So again, you never know how you can help somebody in the future. Be time conscious. Like I said, time is so critically important. Make sure that you stick to the time. Be yourself, right? It's the only way. If I'm talking about culture fit potential, like I was talking about before, the only way that you're going to get there is if you are yourself. And in that way, you'll be able to best ascertain if this next area that you're exploring could potentially be right for you or not. And finally, try and have some fun with it. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but there's some really interesting stuff that you can learn along the way from the individuals that you're talking to. So how to conduct an informational interview. And I mentioned those phases before, right? Phase 1, 2, and 3. Well, for phase 1 and 2, right, that's the exploration and the clarification, validation phases. You can conduct them pretty similarly. You quickly introduce yourself and recap your background. Ask them a little bit about their background, right? Because who doesn't like to talk about themselves, and it helps get the conversation going. Then segue into the questions that you would like to ask. And if it hasn't already come up throughout the course of your informational interview, the time to ask for additional contact names is towards the end. Why is that? Because hopefully by that point in time, you will have been able to establish your credibility, right? And what are you really asking for? When you ask somebody for a contact name, or what are they really providing you? They're really providing them a little piece of their own credibility, right? They're not just going to give those contact names to anybody. You have to establish your own credibility before they say, okay, yes, I can give this contact name to that individual. They will follow up with those people. Then again, ask how you can help them in the future. Again, you never know how you can help some individuals. Either at that point in time, they may say, yeah, I've got something like the example I mentioned, or they may follow up later with an email, or you never know. It could be several years down the line where they reach out to you and say, hey, would you happen to have a moment to, help me in my job search? I'm out there looking at this point in time. So again, you never know how you can help other individuals. And then lastly, but just as importantly, thank them. Thank them for taking the time out of their day, for providing the wisdom and experience that you're hopefully gaining from them. So if that's suggested approach for phase 1 and phase 2, phase 3 is a little bit different. Again, remember, this is the strategic prospecting. At this point, right, you've talked to individuals, you've identified that this is really the company, the job that you'd like to be working at. Hopefully you're actually going to be talking to a hiring manager now for those positions, right? So what you want to do there is best position yourself to establish that you have the skills and abilities to do the job that you're interested in, right? That they supervise. So, again, you start off briefly introducing yourself, recapping your background. You ask them a little bit about their needs, and again, if you've done your homework, you know what's going on with that organization, and you know what some of their needs are. What you can then do is link your skills and abilities to those needs that they have to show that you could benefit that organization, right? So again, it's a little bit different, but you've done your homework at this point. You know who you're talking to and why you're talking to them. Again, ask for any contact names. If it hasn't come up organically, then bring it up towards the end. The great thing about in talking to hiring managers, they will know other hiring managers either within that same company or organization you're interested in, or at other companies which you may be interested in. So again, great individuals to do some networking with and get some additional contact names, and ask how you can help them. in today's world, you never know. That could lead to a short-term consulting gig where you could be helping them out on something, which could in turn then actually lead to a full-time position. You never know. And then finally, thank them again for taking the time out of their day to speak with you. So the questions that I've got here, and again, this would be in that packet that you will receive, and these are just some that I've pulled together. There's so many different sources that are out there. I would use this as a starter, and then do some homework on your own and come up with the questions that you feel most comfortable in asking. So you had your informational interview. And one thing I should probably say here as well is, you know, when things get back to normal, the most ideal place to hold an informational interview with somebody is in their place of employment, right? In that organization, company that you are interested in. Why do I say that? Because there's so much that you can learn about that organization as you sit and wait in the lobby, right? As that individual comes and picks you up to bring you to their office space, right? You get to see what that office is like. You get to see who the coworkers are. Are they interacting with one another? Are they not interacting with one another? Does it seem really frantic, or is it really quiet? Those are all cues to you to then go back up and assess, is this the right culture for me or not the right culture for me? Again, that's what you would ideally like to do when things get back to normal. Clearly now we're not in normal, so using Zoom or FaceTime or Skype, whatever it might be, to do virtual interviews, that's great. And even later on, if you can meet with an individual and they want to meet for a coffee, that's fine too. I would encourage you, though, to try and do it in their place of employment. Ultimately, they will tell you where they want to do the meeting, and you have to, say yes to wherever they would like to meet. But if you can ask to meet there, that's the best. The other thing is be flexible in that. Like I said, if they can't do that, or if they only can talk on the phone, I did a number of informational interviews at 7 o'clock in the morning with individuals who are on their way to work, or individuals at 9 o'clock in the evening when they were on their way home from work. Whatever will work for the individual that you would like to do an informational interview with. So after you've had your informational interview, you want to, of course, follow up and say thank you. You can never say thank you enough. And then the other thing is make sure that you follow up on the leads, right? As I mentioned, they've extended a piece of their own credibility by giving you those contact leads. It's your responsibility to make sure that you follow up on those leads. And then the other thing is, of course, providing occasional progress updates. I typically said, is it okay if I provide you an update on my progress? Invariably, they would say yes, and I would just say, thank you for giving me Susan's name. We had a wonderful informational interview earlier this week. The other thing that I've done, actually, so as I may have mentioned, I went through my transition back in 2008 into 2009. And as I mentioned, I did 125 informational interviews. I still reach out to not all 125, but a goodly number of those individuals that I did informational interviews with on an annual basis. I always contact them to say, thank you so much for the help that you provided me in my transition. This is what's happened to me in the past year. I'm truly thankful for the wisdom that you were able to provide me in my transition. If I can help you in any way in the future, please let me know. And I can't tell you how many people will, A, reach back out to me, say thank you, B, individuals that will reach out to me to say, yeah, can you help with this, or can you help with that? As a matter of fact, the position that I'm currently in at Elmhurst University, I got the lead for that job from somebody that I did my initial informational interviews with, back in 2008. So again, it makes sense to keep in contact with these individuals. Here's a quick sample thank you note. Again, just briefly say, thank you so much for taking out your time out of the day to speak with me. I really appreciate the advice and counsel that you provided. I was also able, again, I asked that question, how can I help you? And he had mentioned that he was having a challenge with social media. Social media was very new at this time. An individual within my accountability group happened to be a social media expert who had just gotten done giving us a presentation on social media. So I was able to provide that person that I did the informational interview with some real help. So again, you never know how you can help individuals. The more and more you do this, right? I don't know if all the folks on the call and where they might be in terms of their knowledge of pop culture, but this is an old ad that was done by Willa Balsam. You tell two friends and they'll tell two friends. If you're doing informational interviewing well and consistently, you will begin to see that you get a number of contacts that you need to be following up on. You could leave an informational interview with one contact. You could leave with an additional 3 contacts. I left some with up to 7, right? And you need to be following up with them. So you need to have some sort of process to make that work. For me, it was a 3-ring binder. I printed out my email ask, and then wrote down what my next steps are. Other people use Excel sheets, other folks use CRMs, whatever you need, but you need to stay on top of this thing, because if you're doing it correctly, the number of people that you're going to be reaching out to will grow pretty exponentially. So any more tips? I think I've mentioned this several times already, but be proactive. Again, you are in charge. Be yourself. Again, if it's about cultural fit, there's no better way than to just be yourself. And hopefully as you talk to individuals, you begin to ascertain if this organization, this industry, whatever it might be, is right for you. If, like you are the individual who kickstarted this whole presentation all those years ago, if you're intimidated by doing informational interviewing, practice on family and friends about things that you're really interested before you start doing informational interviewing. That'll at least give you a little bit of a comfort level with it before you either pick up the phone or send out an email to ask for an informational interview. Other point is, if you're fortunate enough to get into the place of employment to do their informational interview, or even with Zoom, right? You can look through the background and see things in the background. You can start to say, hey, I see that you're a Sox fan like me. Aren't they having a phenomenal year? It starts to warm up the conversation a little bit and begins to build a little bit of a rapport for your informational interview. So before I wrap up, just a couple of things, some tips. I believe this blog is still out there. It's a great one, Shifting Careers. But this is from Joe, who said, the best way to make someone feel good about granting you an informational interview is to show you deserve the time, do your homework, be passionate, be humble, and try and get out of there in under 30 minutes, no matter how well it's going. Leave them knowing 2 things. 1, how appreciative you are, and B, that their advice is more than informational. It will help you get the job done. And just on this particular point, multiple years after I did my transition, I was at a conference, and somebody that I had done an informational interview with reached out to me to basically say, thanks so much for your follow-up notes. I really appreciate it. And she went on to say, it made me feel good. It made me feel like the time that I spent with you was really helpful to you in making your transition. That's what these individuals that say yes to doing informational interviews, that's what they get out of it. So again, You want to make sure that you treat them respectfully, listen to what they have to say, and follow up with their contact leads. If that's the right way to do things, let me share a little bit about how not to do it. This is an example that comes from that same blog, but from Super Dave. My favorite was a friend of a friend of a friend who sent me a gushing email and a plea for information about how to get a job in international journalism. So I sat down, wrote a long, thoughtful email in reply, probably took a half an hour, explaining how things worked. I didn't receive even a cursory acknowledgement that the email had been received, let alone a thank you. But about 4 or 5 months later, I got a request from that same person essentially asking that I sponsor him for a job in my news organization. Is that going to happen? Not. Again, make sure that when you do your informational interviews that you keep in mind you're presenting your brand. It goes right back to the very thing that I started about this, right? Your professional brand. You need to be always cognizant of that and always putting your best foot forward. And with that, vielen Dank, grazie. Thanks, and if I can help any of you, certainly now answer any questions that you might have, or in the future, feel free to reach out to me, or like I said, feel free to revisit this presentation on Prezi.com by just Googling my name and the art of informational interviewing. So thank you, and now I'll open up the questions. Mike, do we have any questions?
For people I have us getting an in-person informational interview, and is it okay to do one through the phone?
Mm-hmm.
So I believe you answered that, right?
Yeah. And actually, that leads to another point. So the examples that I gave is if you're reaching out to an individual, that's a warm lead, right? So you've gotten a contact name from somebody already, and they've given you their name and their email address, and you can follow up. Sometimes you don't have a warm lead. Sometimes, you're just perhaps interested in a company but don't know anybody there. So a way that you can broach that subject is do your homework by doing some research. You can find out, hey, what industry articles are being written up about this organization? Was there somebody mentioned in that article that you found? And then reach out to that individual. That's something that I ended up doing. As I mentioned, I was interested perhaps in doing brand management, maybe something with, again, German. And there is a large international organization called Bosch. They own a number of different companies, and one of which was Skill Tools. They used to be up on Peterson in Chicago. I was really interested in exploring what that might be like. I found an article in a industry trade publication where they mentioned a marketing manager. I reached out to that individual and basically saying, hey, I saw your name in this article. I'd love to learn a little bit more about Skill's go-to-market strategy for new products. Would you have a few moments to talk? That led to a really nice informational interview about Skill and their approach to marketing, etc. As a matter of fact, it went so well that that individual said, hey, we've got an open position, which I did not know about. If you're interested, apply, which I did. And then I even made it to the telephone round of interviews, and then the recession hit in full force, and they basically put a stop to hiring. And then maybe 6 months later, actually, that whole facility was gone on Peterson. So anyway, but that's how I got my foot in the door, through a cold lead. It's important to know cold leads have less of a success rate from an outreach perspective than a warm lead, like when you get somebody's contact name from an individual. But nonetheless, it's still worth trying. It's worth trying. You never know. You might get your foot in the door and it might lead somewhere.
Thanks so much, Marty. I mean, it's always interesting. It's a great tool to have, informational interviewing, and just beyond responding to job ads, because everybody needs an edge nowadays. So
everyone needs an edge, and the rule of thumb that I always used when it came to job search, right? That about 80% of jobs are landed through networking. That's where you should be spending your time when it comes to your job search. Informational interviewing is a wonderful form of networking. Again, it's highly focused, it's personalized, and can be very, very effective tool for you in your search.